My name is Russel Williams, and I've been a developer on the Photoshop team for 23 years, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about how Photoshop was created. When the first version of Photoshop came out, I was at Apple working on the Macintosh operating system. One of my former coworkers come over to Adobe to work on Photoshop like the year before, and he called me up and said, "Hey, here's this opportunity. Would you like to come work on Photoshop?" And I was like, whoa, I could work on this amazing thing. By the time I came over, the things that had been added to it, the big thing that had been added to it was version 3 added layers. And layers were just such a huge deal. They affected the visual language of commercial art. You see this explosion of photo collage, of layering, the influence of layers in Photoshop on the way that commercial art was created. In Photoshop 5.0, the first version I worked on, there was history, which was the very powerful, not just multiple undo, but the ability to jump back at any point in history that no other program had. The next really consequential feature in Photoshop I think of was the healing brush in Photoshop 7. It's used for retouching skin, especially you retouch skin and it blends the edges in. You don't get an edge. Another huge feature was the content aware fill that showed, selecting things in the selecting an object and just hitting delete, and then it would fill in where the object had been. You have more control over pixels, right? Pixels are messy and look like the real world. I knew we had really arrived when I heard Photoshop mentioned in a James Bond movie.
It was cheaper to supply his deputy with evidence that we were bribing the chief. It's amazing what you can do with Photoshop these days, isn't it?
I think Photoshop was added to the dictionary in the mid-2000s as a verb. By the time I came over, the Photoshop team in particular was very small. There were, I don't know, half a dozen engineers, and it was already a multi-million-dollar, many-million-dollar product at that time. Photoshop is one of the most profitable per engineer pieces of software that's ever been created. The first version of Photoshop actually looked very familiar. If you start up version 1.0 of Photoshop today on this computer, you would see something that looks kind of familiar to somebody today. So the first version of Photoshop came on one floppy disk. Microsoft Excel, MS Word, there we go, Photoshop. Zoom work. Keyboard shortcuts, I know, still work. Do we Photoshop too much? If you are trying to represent reality, if you are trying to be documentarian, then yes, it is quite possible to Photoshop too much. In the world of creative imaging, no, there is no too much. That's like saying, do I paint too much? Do I use too much red? This is the box for Photoshop 1.0, and it doesn't even, you can tell it's 1.0 because it doesn't have a version number on it. Macintosh version, program disk. Yes, I'm a very old school geek. I was a geek before being a geek was cool, when it was sort of pathetic to be a geek, and our distinguishing characteristic was social ineptitude. People who hung out at the computer center at 2 in the morning trying to get our programs to work. Having my name on the Photoshop splash screen has been one of the coolest things. I still find it really exciting, and I meet people, either artists or random web designers, who recognize my name. It's like people recognize my name from seeing it on the splash screen. And I thought that's pretty, okay, that's a new kind of nerd. That's a new kind of geek.